Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Bog Panda. This is Kelly at KELLYTHUL on social media. And tonight we're back to doing game reviews, and it's going to be Road Rash on the Genesis. Joining me, as always,
I am Dr. Mike at Official Pagan on everything. You guys are definitely going to want to like and subscribe because I have a feeling this is going to be one of our best game reviews yet. I'm slightly biased because this is one of my all-time favorite games, but you guys are going to leave comments. Tell us why it's one of the greatest games of all time. If you disagree with us, let us know so that everybody else who knows better than you can just tarnish your reputation and take away your reason for living in the comments below. And you know what? For all of us completely correct bullies, we'd feel better doing that if we were wearing Bog Panda t-shirts. And you can find those in our merch store right now. And you know what? Just because you guys are part of our inner circle now, we're going to give you access to the world's shortest podcast. That's hard no. It's right here, free with your free subscription.
and the password is displaying for you right now that you need to enter to get to those free hard nos. If you don't see anything, that's what you enter. So there you go. Um, yeah. As a refresher for those of you, well, I guess it's not if you don't know, but as a reminder, maybe we use the world-renowned, highly scientific panda scale for rating games, 1 to 5 pandas for the various categories. So that's how we'll be rolling things out. It's catching on like fire pretty soon. It's a candidate to Fahrenheit, Celsius, and panda. May soon be a measurement. It may be a unit of measure as well. So the panda as a unit is,
Not distance, though, because that's still reserved for punching Chuck Garrick,
yeah,
as Kelly often points out.
that's right. That is a unit of measurement. But yeah, so let's move on. Anyway, so I didn't know. I knew you viewed this game favorably, but I didn't realize that this was actually one of your top ones. So,
Yeah, I
um,
still have my original Genesis cartridge of
oh,
this 30 some odd years later.
well, it's good
But
because we're going to probably be able to come back to this a couple times. For instance, the 3DO version is, I think, an interesting conversation, and it'll be fun to rate as well. But today we're going to stick with the Genesis version, and let's just I guess anything before we get started. Any preamble you'd like to provide before we go into the rankings?
the only thing I'm going to say, and I only bring this up because I know there's been somehow this debate online again, and I blame our political system for just we love to argue and be divisive about things. But I have seen people our age argue online about Genesis versus Super Nintendo right now in the 2020s online. Mostly spurred on recently by Xenocrisis being ported over to the Super Nintendo and using a helper chip for that, which was a common thing for Super Nintendo games, and Genesis people being like, our system didn't need those. And it feels like being on the playground when when I was, 12 years old or whatever it was at the time. So it's weird. And so I just want to throw out there, I love Sega, I love Nintendo. I was just playing Nintendo 64 before we started doing this. I love Nintendo, I love their consoles. However, Sega Genesis is probably, or Mega Drive, if you're from outside the US, is probably my all time favorite system. It's certainly the system I have spent the most time on. And this game in particular opens up a doorway to talk about a lot of elements of what Genesis does. I'm not putting down Super Nintendo. I'm not part of the debate. We here at Bog Panda are inclusive to both systems. We're not getting into we're way too old to have that debate to start with, but we're not getting into that debate with people. This isn't going to be like that. So just getting it out up front. This was ported, not just, other Road Rash games, but this first game originated on Genesis and was ported to multiple systems, but not Super Nintendo. That's not a commentary on Super Nintendo, just a factual thing. So calm down, Nintendo people.
Yeah, except if you're a virtual boy shill and are pushing to say that was the dominant system, we're gonna have words. Once the Bog Boy comes out, that's a different story. All right, so let's get right to it. As a reminder for folks, the this is a racing game. It's a racing game on motorcycles, and there's violence involved. And so these would be probably some of the things why I think it has an appeal for Mike. But we're going to start off with fun factor. 1 to 5 pandas. I'll let you make your case first, sir.
35 pandas. There's the the pandas are just having a wild cookout party. There's kegs of beer. They're punching each other in the face, but are still friendly. It's just a great time. It's a party that you see and you want to be a part of. It is absolutely 5 pandas for me. This is the most fun you can have in a racing game, in my opinion. And so here's the thing, and you wouldn't necessarily know it by some of our recent reviews because we've talked about games that, I think Kelly and I were pretty much on the same page with, as far as Mario Kart for Nintendo 64 and Beetle Adventure Racing for Nintendo 64. Those are both super fun games, and I really enjoyed those. As a whole, though, racing is not my genre. I don't even drive. I don't have a license. So car stuff doesn't super interest me. A lot of racing stuff is more simulation leaning. So it's more the arcade style stuff, if anything, that I'm drawn to. But Kelly already kind of hit on it. This adds a fighting sort of mechanic into the game as well. And also a little bit of a backstory. And it the backstory much more so in the sequels, but the backstory kind of develops based on how much violence you interject as a player because you start to make enemies with different players and things like that. So there's just more going on under the hood, if you will. There's more going on there than just a traditional racing game. So this was something that really appealed to me. I think I rented it on a whim because one of my friends had it and was raving about it, and I loved it so much that was the next game that I got. I still remember, well, I still have it, but I still remember it was an EA cartridge. And at the time, the EA cartridges looked different than the stock Sega cartridges because they didn't want to pay the extra royalties. So they manufactured their own cartridges. So they looked different. The boxes were different because they weren't getting them from Sega. So the clamshell cases that they came in were slightly bigger. The cartridges were a little bit bigger. Just everything about it made it stand out on a shelf in a store, which you know, wasn't a part of the marketing pitch for it, but as a little kid is something that makes you stop and notice that. It was just because they were making their own off-brand materials and not using Sega's. But again, it made it stand out. I can still picture that box, even if I didn't still actually physically own it. One of my favorite games, I followed the series for quite a while. The first 3 Genesis games, though, are among my favorites. So it's 5 pandas all the way. And I'll get into the other aspects of it when we get there.
Yeah, I was torn a little bit between 4 or 5 pandas on it but then I thought motorcycles, lead pipes, punch people, race. um, uh, I had to go 5 as well. So we're in agreement. 5 pandas as well. Not down from 35. I'm just coming in at 5 and staying at 5. So next, controls.
Controls, I'm going 5 pandas again. Um, it's simple. The control scheme is very simple for this. Again, they're not trying for realism. This is an arcade style game with some fighting mechanics mixed in. You control the bike. The bike handles pretty well. As you race, you have to qualify in each race to move to the next level. This first game is set entirely in California at different locations in California based off real places at different locations in California. As the series progressed, it started to expand from there. Road Rash 2, for example, is all over the US. Road Rash 3 is different parts of the world, and so on. So it's all interesting in that sense. But basically, what you're doing is there's a round of races. You have to qualify by getting a certain position or higher, as you do in most racing kind of base games. Then you can move on to the next set of races, same locations, but the tracks are longer. There's more obstacles, and everybody else but you gets a bike upgrade. And so you have to save up your money from these races to start upgrading your own bike. It's really important to read the stats on those bikes though, because the way it describes their handling is super accurate. So it's not an issue with the controls, but there are some bikes that are faster but don't handle well. So as you're playing, they're just harder on turns and things like that. You'll find yourself spinning out or falling off the bike or slamming into things. Again, though, that's the give and take of upgrading the bike as you go along. So I don't fault the controls for that, but just something to keep in mind. Because I remember rage quitting because I had some bike that just sucked on handling, and then going back and actually reading it and being like, "Oh yeah, it totally says that." And I just I just was like, "New bike." So I love the control zone, especially on the Genesis layout of the original 3 button controller with them side by side. You have your gas right in the center. You don't have to take your finger off the gas to hit the attack button. And it's just simple directional pad button presses for kicks, punches, grabbing weapons, using those. So it's all pretty intuitive, in my opinion, as somebody who's not a racing game person.
Yeah, I think they're pretty clean and simple. I'm going with four pandas on this because we part of it. I mean, so I think that to your point, the controls are simple. They are easy enough to master for you because you're usually doing a couple things. Are navigating, avoiding obstacles, taking turns, but also trying to mix it up a little bit or pick off a weapon or all those types of things. And as we've mentioned on previous racing game shows, I suffer from premature overcorrection, and that I will tend to really overcorrect too much. It it wreaks havoc on things. So the Beetle Adventure Racing island with the lava and stuff was just not good for me. Didn't treat me well at all. This one you still need some skill and you got to use the brake and you've got to kind of think things through a little bit. But I wasn't just a wreck from the beginning. So you do have to, as the courses get harder and the bikes that you do have to upgrade to stay competitive get a little trickier sometimes. It becomes a little more skill involved, but I was able to hang with it a lot longer without the overcorrection issue. So four pandas for me. Okay, now difficulty. Now difficulty, what we do there is, it's not to super difficult is a 5 and super easy is a 1. It's kind of right level of a difficulty for game enjoyment. I have a suspicion, but Mike, what would you rank?
I'm gonna go with 5 pandas on this one, Kelly. 5 pandas. So like I said, the longer races do get tougher. What I like about it though is it's definitely a game. It doesn't use the sort of rubber banding mechanics that you see in something like Mario Kart. There is obstacles and things like that, but not like lava, like adventure racing. But there is traffic, oncoming traffic, and things like that. So I would say for a beginner just starting, if you really don't focus on combat and just focus on getting through the race without getting killed, you'll get the hang of the bikes and the actual mechanics of the racing pretty quickly. And before long, you'll learn how to launch your bike off of rocks and things like that, which are imperative in later races to get ahead of the crowd. And it does let you get way ahead of everybody else. Even in later races, there's been times when I fell off my bike completely, rolled down the street, still had time to go back at my bike, was still in first place because I was so far ahead of the other characters. It also, you can see through the rear view mirrors of the bike who's coming up behind you and things like that. That's a nice mechanic for it. It feels natural, the progression of the difficulty with each round of races. At the time, not that it's branching paths, but the idea that there was a little bit of almost a hint of an open world feel in the sense that you could focus more or less on fighting, which would make other players more or less aggressive towards you at a time when that kind of stuff, nowadays we're used to games having multiple endings and branching paths and things like that based on your choices. At that time, that kind of stuff was not common. So that was pretty unique. And I think that also, as far as it playing into the difficulty, gave you options because there is no like easy, medium, hard settings. But for a more experienced player, you can go in punching people and pushing them out in front of cars right away It's going to make the game rougher on you though, right from the start, because the AI controlled players are going to be more aggressive towards you. So the mechanics of it kind of work to your skill level.
Fair enough. Yeah, so I'm gonna go four pandas on this as well. I almost feel like I have to apologize when I'm not giving you a five.
Damn
But
it, Kelly.
uh,
Why?
are you insane? I'm gonna go
Did
four
you play
pandas as
the
well.
game?
Yeah, I think it's very well executed. Sounds like we're talking about Love It to Death. I think it's very well executed. Um, and I think a good balance. And to your point, there's y- you progress as you get better. The difficulty kind of rides along with your experience a little bit, so in a very fair way from that. And so, and I had mentioned earlier the fact that I was functional in it pretty much out of the get go, made it all that much easier. So I think it does a really good job in not making it a piece of cake, but also making it not also making it actually impossible to win. And the part of that too, and the difficulty is while there are obstacles and you need to work around them, and there's things about launching, as Mike's talking about launching into the air, obstacle avoidance again. So I suffer from overcorrection, and that's not necessarily really good for. They're fairly forgiving obstacles. I mean, you can run a little. There are some games where that you kind of even approach something, and the logic says, "Okay, you're out. I'm wiping you out." Where this one, you square on with a car, you're in trouble. You square on with a tree, you're in trouble. But if it's tight, sometimes you get by okay. So I don't know if forgiving's the right word to use necessarily, but they're not overly punishing in terms of avoidance on some of the obstacles. So I thought I enjoyed that and really appreciated that. All right. So the next thing you're going to give it five for, Mike, is replayability. What would you like to say about your five for replayability?
Well, I'm going to go ahead and I am going to give it that 5, Kelly. So I mean, we're 30 plus years into this and I'm still playing my original cartridge of the game. So I mean, that's all the proof of replayability, I guess, that you would need. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there who prefer Road Rash 2. And I understand this is a Mortal Kombat 2 situation for me, where Mortal Kombat 2 came out. I have more nostalgia for the first Mortal Kombat, but I can objectively notice the upgrade to Mortal Kombat 2. The difference, though, is just like with with Road Rash 2, Mortal Kombat 2, they didn't reinvent the game. The sequel is just an improvement over the first one. It almost feels like an expansion pack. There's better graphics, there's a little bit more animation, new tracks, things like that they add to it, but it's the same core game and core mechanics. So because of that, I find myself, because of the nostalgia, coming back to this one more than I do two. Even though two, again, objectively is a little bit better of a game. Um, Another thing that I think I do see more and more people talking about, but something that bizarrely kept me coming back to it, and I don't know if this is something you noticed, the music is weird in the game. It's a really weird soundtrack to the game. And there's a lot to be said about the Road Rash soundtracks. Because the initial games have this interesting, unique kind of soundtrack to them. And then later it became an early franchise to take on licensed music from like actual bands and things like that. So there was like Soundgarden and Monster Magnet songs and things like that. Again, at a time when that was very uncommon to have that kind of stuff in games. So there's a lot to be said about the overall sound of them. I think that when music is created for the Genesis, so getting the first step into the Super Nintendo versus Genesis thing. Super Nintendo came out after Genesis did. Genesis was actually meant to be a competitor with the NES. Super Nintendo came out a couple years later. It had sample based sounds. The Genesis was still using a chiptune based FM synthesizer in there. The FM synthesizer sounds awesome when they make music for it. It doesn't always work when they try to translate music to it, and it definitely doesn't work if you just drop files that aren't compatible to it. Doom on 32X. It definitely doesn't work then. So you have to make it work for the system. The guy who did the music for this, and I can't remember his name offhand. It might be there if Kelly if Kelly can find it. But he did the music for a number of Genesis games, and he went crazy, I believe, when he was making this music. So right off the bat, you were just hit with this very aggressive, very strange soundtrack that really doesn't sound like anything else that was in games at that time. And I don't know what it's supposed to sound like, but as I don't want to say off-putting, but as strangely attention grabbing as it is at first, I think you very quickly either learn to love it or hate it. And I fell into the love it category to the point where I remember just putting the game on in the background so that that opening title music could play in my room because there wasn't a soundtrack available for it. So that's another thing that brought back the replayability for me as well. And that continues on into the second game. The third game has a different composer. And then after that, they started using the licensed music again, though, ahead of the curve on that. But the weird music, the super fun gameplay, it deserves its 5 that Kelly assumed I was going to give it.
Correctly assumed. So
Still, you
yeah,
shouldn't assume.
yeah. I think it's pretty safe. I think it's pretty safe on this, and I can read the room, so we can see how it goes. So again, so
Give it your
I got
4.
slide it out. Gonna give it a 4. Um, with solid reasons why. And so I agree with a lot of what you said about the music, particularly about not liking it initially. It was it or at least it's very different initially. I really came to believe that particularly the in-game playing soundtrack for Road Rash is the Trout Mask replica of gaming music, and
I
it's
see
the
that.
one where you buy Trout Mask replica because somebody tells you this Captain Beefheart guy put this really great album together called Trout Mask Replica. It's a double album, get it. And you take it home and you put it on, and you're like, "What the hell is going on here?" He's good. They're not even trying, you know. And you regret your purchase, and you pack it away, and then somebody say, "Well, I'll give it another shot." And the second time through, you're like, wow, I don't hate it quite as much. And then you eventually figure out the calculus and the mechanics or the pathway through the music, which is an unusual and unplanned and just kind of different path. But once you kind of decode it in terms of kind of what's going on, or and step away from what you're kind of used to expecting, it can become quite enjoyable. And that's kind of an interesting journey to go on. And I think this music is the same way. That particularly kind of like first race through, you're kind of like, man, this is what I got to listen to. It's kind of like the Ghostbusters theme and the Ghostbusters video game where it's just like, please stop. But over time, you're kind of like, okay, it's melding with the gameplay, and I kind of get the thing. So I think the music is definitely a reason to come back. And so why 4, which is a very respectable replayability score. I sit there. Probably the biggest reason I didn't go with 5 on this, and we've talked about this, particularly with Mario Kart, I think even a little bit with Beetle Adventure Racing. Um, One of the things that will always up replayability is two-player options. When you can kind of go head to head, and you can do some of those things because it just allows new random elements in the game, because you're not playing against an AI. You're playing against some other crazy person who may come up with all sorts of things that you weren't expecting. And so, and just also the kind of camaraderie of playing together. And so, while advertised as having a two-player option, most of us assume when it says two-player option, that's simultaneously both playing, where Road Rash 1, it's not. It's You can do a two-player version, but you're just basically kind of going back and forth through
Yeah.
the progression, where Road Rash 2, you actually get the split screen stuff a little bit more there. So I think the absence of a true simultaneous two-player thing was the reason that I most apologetically provide this with a 4 instead of a 5.
I understand. I would counter though,
Shocker.
if you're really trying to get through the game and all, because it is a lengthy game once you get into it, going through each of the cycles of the races as they get longer and upgrading the bike and everything. You can put some real time into this game. I would argue you don't want to play it as a two-player game in this instance if you're trying to make it through the game. I don't think it has the same appeal that Mario Kart has as a two-player endeavor. However, I do agree the split screen in Road Rash 2 and onward is fun.
I don't know. Oh man, I'm gonna get ripped here. So visual appeal.
Well, Kelly, you might be surprised to learn. We go with a 5. So let me make my case before you. It's not the prettiest game, even at the time. Some of the stuff is a little flat and blocky looking at times. However, it is doing something amazing. And this is where I'm going to really anger the Super Nintendo people. So Super Nintendo came after Sega Genesis. It added the Mode 7 feature, which was one of its main selling points when it first came out, before they started with the helper chips like the Super FX chip and things like that. Mode 7 allowed native scaling and rotation to be done in hardware. Genesis does not have anything like that. And because of that, one of Nintendo's big attacks on Genesis is they couldn't do things like racing games like Mario Kart and Top Gear and things like that. Not only is this doing something it technically shouldn't be able to do, it is running significantly faster than any of those Super Nintendo games are. And that really just comes down to Genesis, even though it was an older system at that point, had a much faster processor, or the blast process, as they like to call it in the marketing. It was just a faster version of a 16-bit Motorola processor. That's one of the reasons that a lot of PC ports, whether it was games ported to consoles or especially from a console to a PC, were usually pulled from the Genesis version, because the Genesis version of a 16-bit processor was more in line with what most PCs, including the Amiga, had at the time. And that's why those games were easy to port back and forth. So this was more like a PC in terms of the power under the hood again, compared to a Super Nintendo. So it's actually running a game that even though Road Rash 2 and on, they figured out ways to make it look better and look a little smooth. Not Road Rash 3, that looks terrible, but Road Rash 2 looks a little bit better. There's a little more animation, everything runs a little bit smoother. That was the first time anybody had seen anything like that. And again, it's running significantly faster than hardware that is actually designed to run games like that. And there's no helper chips. Again, not trying to start a fight with Super Nintendo people. No helper chips or anything. It is doing stuff the hardware cannot do, just from the sheer processing power of what was available and creative programming. 5.
So I'm gonna give it a 3.
Ah.
And
Ah.
so
You're gonna give
uh
Road Rash 3 like a negative
let's
4.
say what's that?
You're gonna give Road Rash 3 like a negative 4 when we get there.
So, three is a passing grade. It is from a visual appeal. It is so it is not it is and we do, when we talk about visual appeal, we do talk about the, within the reasonable limits of the platform. So, it's not fair to kind of say, well, I need this, 1 billion polygon based level of
Right.
quality to stuff like that. So I get that. But I think it would be fair to argue there are many other Genesis games that are more visually appealing than this. The motorcyclists themselves, I mean, for the platform, pretty solid. The pulling off, and I think it's a fair point, to say, kind of, given the limitations of the system or the challenges in executing certain things on the system to pull off what they pull off in terms of a definite solid racing experience is impressive. But if it was a blind greyhound, it would run an impressive race, but it's probably going to end up about the middle of the pack. It's just, it had some limitations, so it's there. So I think, I said, I didn't think there's anything wrong with them. I do think my guess is a lot of, you could have had a little other fun stuff on the side or a little better developed. Um, but some of that had to be sacrificed to give what's most important, which is the gameplay. I think so. I think that's my guess is a little bit is that the energy, the processing power, and the focus came in to say, let me make sure that this feels right, and the course and the interesting but not necessarily that important adornments on the side are a little less important, which is why I don't think the graphics are bad, but I do think there are prettier Genesis games. And I'll go with a three on it on my last show with Mike apparently. So
No. I don't think this is a good looking game necessarily. It's just more about it's doing something that up until that point nobody thought the Genesis could do. And then, of course, with Road Rash 2, they improved on that even more and made it look a little bit better in the process. But it's doing stuff that, later Genesis games, just like any console, the games got better and better the further into it because they learned a lot of programming tricks and things like that. But at that time, there was no inkling that something like that could possibly run on a Genesis because, as far as everyone knew, it just couldn't do scaling and rotation like that. So
so the
it
math
should be
is
a 5.
so the math is going to be pretty easy for Mike on this one. We have five categories, and I believe he gave a 5 for everything. So this would be 25 would be the score for Road Rash for Mike. I believe that will put it at the top of your list. I don't see how it couldn't. I'll end up at 20 for mine, which while might seem unforgivable to Mike on many levels, I would like to point out does put it at the top of my list now. So in terms of the games we've rated so far, this is the most pandas I have given any game. So just get all the way off my back. So we'll see how it goes there.
It's definitely a love it to death. I'm waiting for the $1 billion baby shoe to drop.
So we'll include a link to one of the two reviews of $1 billion Babies or Love It to Death, so that you can enjoy that debate as well. But this is a good game. We'll probably be talking about it a lot more. I now have some background to figure out ways to pump up my score to make sure I come into this. I'm going to, but there's future versions of it are interesting. Mike's point's valid that they are they build upon the core stays kind of the same,
Yeah.
but some of the stuff adjusts. The simultaneous two-player stuff pretty cool. And obviously there's some big visual improvements that occur, whether it's in 3DO land or something like that. Then you can start getting licensed music with 3DO and others. So some interesting things there. So that is our latest game ranking. Would love to hear in the comments what your thoughts are. Warning, say good things. Michael come get you. And anything you'd like to add before we wrap it up?
This was ported to multiple systems, not Super Nintendo, but it was ported to Game Boy, which is odd that it skipped Super Nintendo. I saw something and I didn't do enough research to know if this was true. I did see a post somewhere in some article about it that at one point there was a Super Nintendo version planned and then it just didn't happen. Maybe it was just because Road Rash 2 was already ready at that point and it didn't make sense to go backwards and port this when Road Rash 2 was coming, but Road Rash as a franchise never made it to Super Nintendo. But this one was ported to Game Game Boy. It was ported to Sega Master System and Game Gear. And those three are all way better than you would think they were, considering that, they're significantly less powerful than the Genesis. They make it work for the hardware on each of those. There's also an Amiga version, which is pretty close to the Genesis version, going back to what we had kind of touched on. The Amiga in particular and Genesis had a similar processor. So it made porting things back and forth between them apparently fairly easy. So the Amiga version is pretty close to this.
Cool. I have to check that out on my Super Console X or my RG35XX. So maybe a better way to. It'll actually be a fun form factor to play this game on. So we'll give her a check. Excellent. Well, let us know in the comments what you think, agree, disagree, and looking forward to chatting with Mike about another game down the road. Thanks for watching, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bog Panda.